There's a moment in any great chess match when one player makes a move so unexpected, so geometrically precise, that the entire board transforms in meaning. What Russia just did in defending Iran's right to continue uranium enrichment is exactly that kind of move. And if you're only reading the headlines, you're watching the wrong game entirely. What the mainstream narrative is selling you is a story about nuclear weapons, rogue states, and a defiant Russia poking the West in the eye. That's the surface, but underneath that surface sits something far more profound, far more consequential, and frankly far more revealing about where the entire architecture of global power is heading. So stay with me, because I want to walk you through what's actually happening here, and I promise you by the time we reach the end of this conversation, you will never look at the Iran nuclear file the same way again. Let's start with the basics, not because you don't know them, but because context is everything in geopolitics. Russia's foreign ministry, specifically through spokeswoman Maria Zakharova and reinforced by senior diplomatic channels, has made it unmistakably clear that Iran possesses the sovereign right to develop its civilian nuclear program, including uranium enrichment, within the framework of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, the Western press immediately framed this as Russia being obstructionist, as Moscow throwing a wrench into Western-led diplomacy, as Putin weaponizing Iran to spite Washington. And here is where I want you to pause and ask yourself the first real question of this conversation. When was the last time you heard the Western press frame any Russian or Iranian diplomatic position in anything other than adversarial terms? Because that framing itself is the product, that framing is the marketing ploy, and understanding why that ploy exists tells you more about the real geopolitical stakes than any op-ed in the Washington Post ever will. Russia's position on Iran's nuclear rights is not new. It is not a reaction to Donald Trump's return to the White House. It is not a response to recent Israeli strikes on Iranian territory, and it is certainly not a tactical maneuver born out of desperation from the war in Ukraine. Russia's position is rooted in a legal framework that the Western powers themselves helped construct, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, which explicitly guarantees the right of all signatory states to develop peaceful nuclear energy, including enrichment. Iran is a signatory. Russia is reminding the world of that legal reality, and the West's discomfort with that reminder reveals something far more important than any Iranian centrifuge ever could. But to understand why this matters so deeply right now, we have to look at the broader transformation that has been reshaping the global order since at least 2022. What we are witnessing is not simply a diplomatic disagreement over enrichment percentages. What we are witnessing is the collapse of the Western monopoly on defining international legitimacy. For 70 years, the United States and its allies operated as the self-appointed arbiters of what was acceptable behavior in international relations. They decided which countries deserved sanctions and which deserved investment. They decided which nuclear programs were peaceful and which were existential threats. They decided which governments were democratic and which were authoritarian. And the entire international institutional architecture, the UN Security Council, the IAEA, the IMF, the World Bank, was either designed or gradually captured to reinforce those Western determinations. Russia's defense of Iran is a direct and deliberate challenge to that entire system of self-appointed arbitration. Think about what Russia is actually saying when it defends Iranian enrichment. It is not saying that Iran should build a nuclear weapon. It is saying something far more revolutionary in the context of the post-World War II order. It is saying that the United States does not have the authority to unilaterally decide which countries are allowed to exercise their treaty-given rights. That is a statement that resonates not just in Tehran, but in Riyadh, in Ankara, in New Delhi, in Jakarta, in Pretoria, and in every capital of the global south that has spent decades watching the rules get bent, broken, or rewritten the moment they became inconvenient for Washington. And this is the critical realization I want you to hold on to as we go deeper into this conversation, because I'm going to come back to it in the final section. And when I do, I think it will fundamentally change how you understand not just the Iran nuclear question, but the entire trajectory of the coming decade. Now let's talk about the United States' current posture on Iran, because it is genuinely fascinating in its contradictions. On one hand, the Trump administration has reopened diplomatic channels with Iran, and there have been multiple rounds of indirect and even reportedly direct negotiations aimed at some kind of new nuclear understanding. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has spoken about the possibility of a deal. Trump himself has dangled the prospect of normalization. There is a real and urgent American desire to prevent Iran from crossing the threshold into nuclear weapons capability, particularly given what is happening in the broader Middle East theater following the October 7th attack, the Gaza war, the degradation of Hezbollah, and Israel's demonstration that it can strike deep inside Iranian territory. So Washington wants a deal, Washington needs a deal, and yet Washington continues to insist that the price of that deal is the complete dismantlement of Iranian enrichment infrastructure, a demand that even the most pro-Western Iranian technocrat would describe as politically impossible for the Iranian government to accept. And here is where Russia's intervention becomes strategically brilliant rather than simply obstructionist. By publicly and firmly defending Iran's right to enrich, Russia is performing several functions simultaneously on this geopolitical chessboard. First, it is strengthening Iran's negotiating hand. When you have the world's second-largest nuclear arsenal standing publicly beside you and saying your position is legally valid under international law, you do not need to make panicked concessions under the pressure of sanctions and military threats. Iran can sit at the table with a degree of confidence that it would not otherwise possess. Second, Russia is sending a signal to every other country in the world that is watching this negotiation, and they are all watching, that the era of American unilateralism in arms control and nuclear policy is over. Third, Russia is deepening the partnership with Iran that has become one of the most consequential geopolitical alignments of the 21st century so far, a partnership built not on shared ideology, but on shared strategic necessity, shared adversaries, and a shared vision of a multipolar world. Let me dwell on that Russia-Iran relationship for a moment, because I think it is vastly underestimated in Western strategic thinking. The West has spent years trying to drive wedges between Moscow and Tehran, assuming that Russian and Iranian interests were ultimately incompatible, that Russia would eventually sacrifice Iran on the altar of a grand bargain with the West. That assumption has been proven catastrophically wrong. The Ukrainian conflict accelerated and cemented the Russia-Iran axis in ways that would have been difficult to predict even 5 years ago. Iranian drones, specifically the Shahed series, have become a significant component of Russian military operations in Ukraine. In return, Russia has reportedly provided Iran with advanced air defense systems, military technology transfers, and diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. This is not an alliance of convenience anymore. This is a structural partnership that has been forged in the heat of shared confrontation with Western power. And within that structure, Russia defending Iran's nuclear rights is not a favor. It is a logical extension of a deeply integrated strategic relationship. Now, I want to bring Israel into this picture because no analysis of the Iran nuclear question is complete without understanding the Israeli dimension, and because the Israeli dimension illuminates something very important about the limits of American power in the region. Israel has been the most vocal and the most operationally aggressive actor in opposing Iranian nuclear development. Israeli intelligence operations have assassinated Iranian nuclear scientists. Israeli cyber operations, most famously Stuxnet, have physically destroyed Iranian centrifuges. Israeli airstrikes have targeted Iranian military infrastructure inside Syria. And in 2024, in a historic escalation, Israel conducted direct strikes on Iranian territory, something that would have been considered almost unthinkable a decade ago. Israel's strategic objective is clear and has been consistent across multiple governments and multiple American administrations: prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability by diplomacy if possible, by military force if necessary. But here is the tension that nobody in Washington wants to discuss openly. The more aggressively Israel acts against Iran, the more it demonstrates to Iran and to every other country watching that not having a nuclear deterrent is an existential vulnerability. North Korea drew this lesson explicitly. After watching what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, both of whom abandoned or never developed nuclear programs, and then watching what has not happened to North Korea, which has nuclear weapons, the lesson is disturbingly clear. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate insurance policy against regime change. Iran's leadership, regardless of whatever deal might be negotiated, understands this lesson at a bone-deep level. And Russia, by defending Iran's enrichment rights, is implicitly acknowledging the legitimacy of that security calculus. Does that make you uncomfortable? Good, because it should. And I want you to think about that and share your perspective in the comments. Do you believe that any country facing the kind of sustained military and economic pressure that Iran has faced has a legitimate security argument for developing a nuclear deterrent? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that serious strategists are wrestling with right now. Let's now turn to the economic dimension of this story, because geopolitics without economics is like watching a chess game without understanding that the pieces are also currency. Iran sits on some of the world's largest proven reserves of both oil and natural gas. It occupies one of the most strategically vital geographic positions on the planet, controlling or at minimum having the capacity to close the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes. An Iran that is permanently sanctioned, permanently isolated, and permanently constrained by Western economic warfare is an Iran that cannot develop its hydrocarbon resources to anywhere near their potential. But an Iran that emerges from the nuclear standoff with its enrichment program intact, even if constrained by inspection regimes, is an Iran that can begin reconnecting to the global economy, particularly the Chinese and Russian-led parallel economy that is being constructed specifically to root around Western sanctions architecture. China is the key variable here that Western commentary consistently underweights. China has been Iran's most important economic lifeline throughout the maximum pressure sanctions period. Chinese companies have continued to purchase Iranian oil through grey market channels and direct arrangements that Washington has been unable or unwilling to fully stop. The China-Iran Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, signed in 2021, envisioned 25 years of economic cooperation worth potentially $400 billion. That agreement, along with Iran's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and its accession to BRICS, represents the most consequential geopolitical repositioning Iran has undergone since the 1979 revolution. And in that context, Russia defending Iran's nuclear rights at the diplomatic level is perfectly complementary to China's economic integration of Iran at the commercial level. These are not independent actions. They are coordinated moves on the same chessboard by players who, whatever their individual differences and occasional tensions, share a common strategic interest in preventing the United States from using nuclear non-proliferation as a tool to strangle a geopolitical rival. Now, here is something I want you to think about very carefully, because this is where the mainstream narrative really falls apart. The United States currently possesses approximately 5,400 nuclear warheads. Russia has approximately 5,500. Together, the two countries that are arguing most forcefully about Uranium enrichment possess more than 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. Israel, which has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and therefore operates outside its inspection regime entirely, is believed to possess between 80 and 400 nuclear warheads, though it maintains a policy of deliberate ambiguity on this point. Pakistan and India, who have fought multiple wars and remain in a state of chronic military tension, both have nuclear arsenals. North Korea has nuclear weapons and is actively developing longer-range delivery systems. And yet the entire weight of Western diplomatic and military pressure, the entire narrative architecture of nuclear danger, is focused almost exclusively on Iran, a country that does not have a single nuclear weapon and that the IAEA has not found to be in violation of its core NPT obligations. Why? I want you to sit with that question. Why does Iran's civilian enrichment program generate more Western military planning, more sanctions, more covert operations, and more rhetorical urgency than the actual nuclear arsenals of multiple other states? The answer to that question is not about nuclear weapons at all. It is about something else entirely. And this connects directly to the critical realization I mentioned earlier, so let me now bring it fully into focus. The Iran nuclear issue has never primarily been about nuclear weapons. It has been about control. Control over Iran's political orientation, control over its oil and gas resources, control over its relationship with Israel, control over its position in the broader Middle Eastern order that the United States has spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives trying to shape since at least the 1953 CYA coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah. The nuclear issue is the lever. It is the mechanism through which Western powers maintain maximum economic and diplomatic pressure on a country that made the strategic error, from Washington's perspective, of having a revolution that expelled American influence. Every other justification is secondary. The nuclear concern is real, I am not dismissing it, but it is instrumentalized in service of a much broader goal of political control. Russia knows this, China knows this, Iran certainly knows this, and now, increasingly, the global South knows this, and that knowledge is what is destroying the credibility of Western-led institutions and driving the very multipolar realignment that Washington is desperately trying to prevent. So when Russia stands at a podium and says that Iran has the right to enrich uranium within the bounds of the NPT, it is landing a blow not just on American Iran policy, it is landing a blow on the entire post-Cold War mythology of American benevolent leadership. It is saying, in the most diplomatically precise and therefore the most cutting way possible, that the emperor's nuclear clothes do not fit, and that message is being heard. Let me tell you how it is being heard in the places that matter most, in the corridors of the African Union, where country after country is expelling French and American military presences and turning toward Russian and Chinese security partnerships. In Southeast Asia, where ASEAN nations are carefully balancing their economic relationships with China against their security relationships with the United States, and increasingly finding that balance tilting. In Latin America, where leftist governments from Mexico to Brazil to Venezuela are articulating positions on Iran that would have been politically impossible a decade ago. The world is listening to Russia's defense of Iranian rights not as an isolated diplomatic statement, but as a data point in a much larger pattern, the pattern of Western hegemonic retreat. Now let me give you the strategic prognosis, because I think you deserve more than just a diagnosis. Where does this go? In the near term, the nuclear negotiations will likely produce some kind of interim agreement, some partial deal that allows both sides to claim a degree of victory. Iran is not suicidal. Its leadership understands that the country's economic development requires some degree of normalization with the global financial system. Even if it has a parallel track with China and Russia, the United States needs a deal before Iran enriches to levels that make Israeli military action politically irresistible to Netanyahu or his successors. So there is a functional pressure driving both sides towards some kind of temporary accommodation. But that accommodation will not resolve the underlying structural tension, because the underlying structural tension is not about centrifuges. It is about sovereignty and multipolarity versus hegemony and unipolarity. That tension cannot be resolved by a nuclear deal. It can only be resolved by the completion of the systemic shift that is already underway, a shift from a world where one power defines the rules to a world where multiple powers negotiate them. Russia's role in that shift is not passive. Russia is not merely reacting to Western pressure. It is actively constructing the architecture of the alternative. The joint military exercises, the energy infrastructure agreements, the payment systems designed to circumvent SWIFT, the diplomatic coordination at the SCO and BRICS levels, the deliberate normalization of partnerships with countries that Washington has designated as pariahs, all of this is a coherent, if imperfectly executed, strategy to build a world where American unilateralism is structurally impossible. Iran is a cornerstone of that project. A Iran that retains its enrichment capability is an Iran that has demonstrated that American coercive pressure has limits. And a Iran that has demonstrated those limits sends a message to every other country contemplating the costs and benefits of defying Washington. That message is arguably more valuable to Russia's long-term strategic position than any specific military or economic transaction. I want to ask you something else before we close, something I genuinely want your perspective on in the comments. There is a school of thought emerging in American strategic circles, not in the mainstream, but in the serious corners of the foreign policy establishment, that argues the United States has fundamentally miscalculated on Iran, that 30-plus years of maximum pressure has not changed Iranian behavior in any of the ways it was intended to, and that a genuine grand bargain that respects Iranian sovereignty and accepts some degree of enrichment in exchange for robust inspections and political normalization would actually serve American security interests better than continued confrontation. Do you believe that American domestic politics, specifically the Israeli lobby, the defense industry, and the neoconservative intellectual infrastructure, makes that kind of rational recalculation possible? Or is the American political system now structurally incapable of the kind of strategic course correction that this moment demands? Because how you answer that question determines whether you see the coming years as a period of managed transition or as a period of dangerous escalation. Here is where I want to leave you. Russia's defense of Iran's enrichment rights is not a crisis. It is a clarification. It is the international system clarifying loudly and unmistakably that the rules it will operate by in the coming decades are going to be negotiated, not dictated. That is uncomfortable for a country that has spent 70 years dictating them. It is uncomfortable for the allies who have benefited from that arrangement. And it is deeply, viscerally unsettling for the strategic class in Washington that has built entire careers on the assumption of permanent American primacy. But discomfort is not catastrophe, and clarity, even painful clarity, is always preferable to the comfortable illusion of control. The chessboard has changed, the pieces are different, and the players who understand the new geometry of this game will navigate what comes next with far greater effectiveness than those who are still trying to play by the old rules. Russia, for all its well-documented problems and contradictions, understands the new geometry. Whether the United States can adapt to it in time, That, my friends, is the most important geopolitical question of our era.